In this episode, we're going to take another dive into the Old Testament looking for Jesus. And it really just continues to amaze me how much of the life of Jesus is based in the Hebrew scriptures and how important it is to have that Old Testament context to really understand Jesus and his teaching. So in this episode, we're going to examine a title that was incredibly important to Jesus himself. You know, Jesus had so many names and titles, but there's one that Jesus used almost exclusively when he referred to himself. You know, he didn't refer to himself as teacher or rabbi or master. Those were titles that others used of him, titles of respect when they spoke or addressed Jesus. But when Jesus spoke of himself, he mostly used the name the Son of Man, like in this verse. Now, I really like Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, but just think about what Jesus is saying here. He wants to know what the people of his day thought of him. It's pretty deep into his ministry. He wants to know what the average Jew or who the average Jew thought he was. But before finding out what the word was on the street, as it were, in the question, Jesus actually tells the disciples who he was. Don't know if you've noticed that, but like he's told them so many times before, and as he will again, he says, I'm the Son of Man. And for some reason, this is very important to Jesus. But if we just go back to what the average Jew thought of Jesus and who he was, what was the answer to Jesus' question? And Matthew, this chapter has a really cool context. It's the chapter where Peter is praised for knowing that Jesus was the Son of God. But in response to Jesus' question, the disciples said, well, some people think you're John the Baptist, that you've been raised from the dead. And others suggest that you might be Elijah, who was prophesied would come. Others say that you might be Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. But when Jesus asked the disciples, you know, who they thought he was, well, this is when you get this incredible response from Peter, who says, you are the Christ, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And so what I like about this passage is that in the space of just a couple of verses, we have the two aspects of Jesus' nature described. He's the Son of God, the Son of the living God, but he's also, as he describes himself, the Son of Man. So God is his father, but don't forget that Mary was his mother. But I guess the question still arises, well, why did Jesus choose to refer to himself so often as the Son of Man? And I did a little bit of searching of how Jesus refers to himself. And he refers to himself as the Son of God less than half a dozen times. What I found was 5. He never refers to himself as God, but he refers to himself as the Son of Man 83 times. Now, that phrase, Son of Man, is only found in the New Testament 88 times. So in all but 5 occurrences in the New Testament of this phrase, it's about Jesus, and it's about Jesus referring to himself. So what was he trying to emphasize? And because our sessions are all about Jesus in the context of the Old Testament, what light does the Old Testament shed on this peculiar title? So as we do, off we go to the Old Testament. Now, if you were to search that phrase, Son of Man, in the Old Testament, you'll find another 108 occurrences of the phrase. Now, of course, that's not Jesus referring to himself. It's in the Old Testament. And one of those is in Numbers 23. And just a little tip, more often than not, the first time a word or phrase is used in the Bible is pretty important. And we're going to use the first time it shows up in Numbers as an example. So Numbers chapter 23, it's a verse about God. It's a prophecy. The words are being spoken by one of God's prophets, the prophet Balaam, but they are the words of God himself. And when you read through that verse, what you find out is God is saying, look, I am not a man. He's making a contrast. He says, look, men change their minds, men lie, but God says, I don't. If I say something, it's going to happen. I'm not a man. And to put some emphasis on it, God says, I'm not a son of man. So if we take that phrase and we think about the phrase Son of Man, this verse helps us understand what that means. Son of man is essentially equivalent to saying man, but with emphasis. You see, if you're the son of a man, you're literally a man, but you're also a man to the second generation. It's sort of a form of emphasis. And so God's saying here, look, I'm God and I'm different. Now in Hebrew, sometimes it's useful to look up the Hebrew word. Sometimes it's hard to get anything out of that. But I put this on the screen because in Hebrew, the Son of Man is two words. It's the word ben, which means son. And the reason I put it up is because of what the word is for man. It's Adam. It's the name of the first human. So Adam is the Hebrew word for man, but it's also alerting to us that, when you say you're a son of man, it means that you're part of the human race. You're a son of Adam. Now, that phrase in Numbers 23 is pretty generic. And I think when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, this is probably not necessarily the verse that he's thinking of, but the concept is important because it emphasizes, and Jesus emphasizes his humanity. Even that reference in the New Testament, when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, it's very generic as well. It's in Greek, weos anthropos. And again, I put it up here for you because we think of the word anthropology. So weos is son, but it's the word anthropology or anthropos that we think of. Anthropology being the study of human societies. So Jesus is literally saying, when he uses this title of himself, I'm the son of a human being. And so both Old and New Testament, that's what the phrase Son of Man refers to. Now just tuck that away in your mind, that Jesus is contrasting that he's human in contrast to God, as was noted in Numbers. So while that phrase Son of Man is rather generic, there's actually two incredibly significant ways it's used in the Old Testament. Two important references that I'm certain Jesus was thinking of as he uses this title of himself. And the first relates to another prophet, another Israelite who was sent by God to the nation of Israel. And that prophet was Ezekiel. Now, there's lots of prophets in the Old Testament, many which you are much more well known than Ezekiel. But if you asked a Bible scholar which prophet was called the Son of Man, they're all going to answer immediately and say, Ezekiel. You see, Ezekiel was called the Son of Man 93 times. In fact, there's only 15 times in the Old Testament that phrase Son of Man doesn't refer to Ezekiel. So when Jesus asked his disciples who the prophets thought he was, and they responded, well, maybe he's one of the prophets, Ezekiel could have been one of those prophets, or should have been one of those prophets that was on their minds. Now, if you look up those 93 references to Ezekiel, you're going to find a key difference. Ezekiel is never using that term of himself. In fact, it's quite the opposite. In all 93 occurrences, it's someone else calling Ezekiel Son of Man, and every time it's God calling Ezekiel Son of Man. He's saying, you're a son of Adam. And the point is that God is taking a prophet, a man, and he's making him his spokesperson. So Ezekiel is a prophet, and God put his words in the mouth of a man. And one of those 93 references, we're going to look at a few of them. One of them is in Ezekiel chapter 2. In fact, this is the second reference to Ezekiel being the Son of Man. And what God says to him is, I'm going to send you to the children of Israel, and they need you because they're a rebellious nation. Now, both of those aspects could equally apply to Jesus. Jesus is identifying himself with Ezekiel. Jesus was sent to the nation of Israel, and Jesus was telling the nation that they were rebellious and in need of repentance. And if you continue on, the similarities continue. So in verse 6, God tells Ezekiel, well, don't be afraid, but you're going to face some trials here. They're going to speak evil of you. They're going to hurt you with briars and thorns. It's going to be like living among scorpions. And you see, that's exactly what applied to Jesus too. He was God's spokesperson, but the people spoke evil of him. They bruised him with thorns when they crucified him. These are the things that Jesus experienced. But all God wanted Ezekiel to do despite these difficulties, was to repeat all the words that he had given him. So in Ezekiel chapter 3, still part of his calling, God says to Ezekiel, calling him Son of Man, I've made you a watchman to the house of Israel. So every word that I give you, I want you to speak it back to them. You're going to be my spokesperson. You're going to give warning to the people of Israel. And Ezekiel did this. Despite the danger, he never left out a word of what God asked him to speak. And look at what Jesus says in John chapter 12. He says, I have not spoken of myself, but the Father which sent me. He gave me a commandment, what I should say and what I should speak. And I can't leave out this verse in Ezekiel chapter 17 because of its connection to a previous webinar. We looked at how Jesus was a prophet that spoke in parables. Well, Ezekiel, more than any other prophet, taught the people of God in parables. He was a prophet of sign. He acted out God's message so that the people could better visualize it. And so here, God is telling the Son of Man, Ezekiel, to put forth a riddle and speak parables to the house of Israel. And you'll remember in our previous webinar, we looked at how Jesus spoke to the multitude, spoke to the nation of Israel in parables. So with an Old Testament background, you start to understand why Jesus was calling himself the Son of Man and what he was trying to get across. He was trying to tell them that he was a prophet sent by God. And although he was a man, he was delivering a message directly from God. God had commissioned him, like Ezekiel, to be his spokesperson. And unfortunately, like Ezekiel, he knew that the majority of the nation was going to ignore his message and try to put him to death. Well, that's one of two very important Old Testament contexts to Jesus' title. The second is a little bit less obvious. Now, we went to Ezekiel because there's so many references to the Son of Man, but we're going to finish in Daniel because there is one reference that is very pointedly speaking about Jesus Christ. And I think Jesus would have hoped that his followers would have connected the dots. So it's in Daniel chapter 7, another prophecy. And look at the reference here. So Daniel sees a vision, and he sees one like the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. And look what it says in verse 14. There was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. You see, the Old Testament not only used this term to speak of a prophet, it used it to speak of an unfulfilled prophecy that the Jews knew well. They were looking for a man, a prophet who would come, who was sent from God, who would use the title the Son of Man. And that prophet would be given dominion. And you see, the Jews were looking for that prophet. In part, that's why they rejected Jesus, because Jesus showed no signs of being that savior that would save them from the Roman overlords and set up a kingdom and a dominion of his own. But that doesn't mean these words don't apply to Jesus. In fact, he's the Son of Man. He wants us to connect this to Daniel chapter 7. And in fact, we have a reference in Jesus' own words himself, where he says, when he's asked, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Well, Jesus says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. You see, that prophecy in Daniel was not fulfilled when Jesus came the first time, but it will be fulfilled when Jesus returns to the earth to be king. So let's just do a quick recap. Jesus doesn't call himself God. He rarely calls himself the Son of God, but what he likes to call himself is the Son of Man. And Jesus, with our understanding of the Old Testament, does that with a purpose, because he was telling the people that he was a man. But not just a man, he was a man who was born to a human. Mary was his mother. He possessed all the characteristics that we have. But he was also like the prophet that they knew well of the Old Testament, the Son of Man, who was the prophet Ezekiel, a prophet sent by God to a rebellious nation who was speaking the words that God put into his mouth. And finally, Jesus wanted the people to realize that although he came in this way, that he was going to be the king who would fulfill the prophecy that was given to Daniel, that he was the man who would come with the clouds of heaven, who would be given a kingdom and authority. But the thing is that that part still has to be fulfilled. And one day, you and I are going to be the ones that see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he's going to set up God's kingdom on earth. So there's quite a lot that's packed into that title that Jesus used. And I hope you agree with me that having an understanding of the Old Testament really helps us understand the message that Jesus gives.